In Pennsylvania, a missing persons case quickly turns into a homicide investigation. Only a piece of rope can link a suspect to the murder. Detectives in Washington state discover a family brutally murdered. To expose the killer, forensic examiners look to the victim's own blood. A 13-year-old boy in Phoenix, Arizona vanishes without a trace. With no body and little physical evidence, investigators struggle to make their case. When juveniles commit murder, homicide detectives enter a realm of twisted logic. They turn to forensic examiners to follow the evidence, not the excuses, when promising lives become wasted youth. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Cambria County lies in the rural northeastern highlands of Pennsylvania. It's a small, tight-knit community that experiences few violent crimes. But on November 6, 1997, Ronald Klotz discovered that his son was missing. He told police that his 15-year-old son, Micah Pollock, never returned home from school that day. He said he and his son were very close, and it was unlike Micah to take off and not check in. Mr. Klotz explained that Micah had come to live with him the previous spring. He had moved to Pennsylvania from Ohio, where he had been living with his mother. Micah seemed happy in his new home and was enjoying making new friends. Ronald Klotz's ex-wife said she hadn't heard from Micah in some time. Though teenage boys often run away from home, Detective Greg Batcher of the Pennsylvania State Police soon learned it was unlikely that this was the case with Micah.
As we began to talk to his friends, they said that he wouldn't do that. They said that he was not the kind of person who would just up and leave. He had no reason to up and leave, and that that's when the suspicion began.
Investigators learned that the missing teenager had recently begun dating a girl from school. When questioned, the girl told police that on the day Micah disappeared, he told her he was going hunting with 16-year-old Andrew Callahan. That surprised her. Andrew Callahan was her ex-boyfriend, and he seemed to resent Micah. She explained that when she and Andrew broke up, she began seeing Micah. But Andrew was possessive and had even threatened Micah on a few occasions. Andrew couldn't seem to let go.
He was very jealous, very demanding of her, and it just, according to her, that he was just, watching her all the time. He did not want her to be with someone else.
She wasn't sure if Micah had actually gone on the hunting trip with Andrew that day. Several days passed with no word from the teenager. Police, friends, and neighbors organized a search of the area surrounding Micah's home. But their efforts turned up no clues to the missing boy's whereabouts. Desperate for a lead, police set up a roadblock nearby and questioned passing motorists. Though it seemed like a long shot, the effort paid off. A man recognized a photograph of Micah. He was in the area a few days before, and while pulled over in his vehicle, he had seen Micah with another teenager. They were heading toward an abandoned strip mine. The boy with Micah carried a shotgun over his shoulder. He thought the other teenager could have been Andrew Callahan. The next day, police and forensic technicians followed up on the lead. They traveled to the strip mines where the motorist had seen the two teenagers a few days earlier. Recent heavy rains made searching the area for clues a challenge. But soon after the search began, investigators found something that seemed out of place. It was a trash can in relatively good condition. Technicians found several red droplets on the can. They tested positive for blood. Investigators preserved the murky rainwater from inside the can for further testing. A search of the surrounding area failed to yield any additional clues. All of the evidence was forwarded to forensic examiners. At the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab, criminalist Bruce Tackett first needed to determine if the bloodstains on the trash can had originated from an animal or a human. Using a chemical that reacts to proteins in human blood by turning pink, Tackett concluded the blood was human. But to generate a genetic profile from the evidence, Tackett would need additional samples. The remaining stains were too degraded for a more comprehensive analysis. Though there was a chance that blood was present within the liquid contents of the trash can, he realized that the rainwater had likely diluted it. The only way to extract remaining blood proteins would be to first remove the water from the sample. Tackett poured the liquid into a pan and then placed it in an evaporation chamber. In this dry environment, with an air current passing over the sample, the liquid was slowly removed and the solids became more concentrated. After most of the water had evaporated, Tackett tested the sample to see if there was any blood protein in the residue. He couldn't detect any, but he did find a potentially valuable piece of trace evidence: a single strand of human hair. Though there was no way to confirm whose hair it was, police feared it had originated from Micah Pollock. Investigators returned to the area around the strip mines where they found the trash can. This time, they brought a cadaver dog. The dog signaled to a nearby beaver pond. There, in a shallow area of the pond, searchers found the decomposed body of a young man. The victim had been shot in the back. His ankles were bound with rope and his clothes severely tattered. Through dental records, the medical examiner confirmed that the week-long search for Micah Pollock had finally come to a tragic end. Micah had been killed by a 12-gauge shotgun fired at close range. And based on the bruises and abrasions to the body, the examiner concluded that the teenager had been killed elsewhere, then dragged to the place where his body was found. Now, investigators turned their focus to finding the boy's killer. 16-year-old Andrew Callahan, the last person seen with Micah Pollock, was their prime suspect. With his father present, the teenager refused to answer any questions without an attorney.
Andrew, I have no choice but to arrest you.
Though the case against him was largely circumstantial, investigators placed Callahan under arrest for suspicion of murder.
Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
Detectives secured warrants to search the Callahan family's home and vehicles. Almost immediately, they found a clue.
And as we were going up the driveway, you could see something hanging from the back of the vehicle near the bumper. As we got closer, it was obvious that it was a piece of rope hanging from the vehicle.
It appeared to be the same type of rope found tied around Micah's ankles. As the team made their way to the residence, they discovered more rope on the porch. From inside the house, they retrieved 4 shotguns and a bag of hunting clothes that belonged to Andrew. All of the items were sent to the crime lab for testing. Ballistics testing on shotgun pellets is nearly impossible.
Sergeant Badger may help you.
And in this case, examiners were unable to demonstrate that the shotguns retrieved from the Callahan's home had been used to murder Micah Pollock. But if technicians could identify even a tiny droplet of Micah's blood on Andrew's hunting clothes, police would be one step closer to tying the suspect to the crime. But none of the clothing samples tested positive for blood.
Some of the results were from the lab.
Though convinced of Andrew Callahan's guilt, police couldn't seem to find a shred of physical evidence linking him to the crime. With the suspect unwilling to cooperate, investigators were running out of ways to prove that Callahan was a killer. Police in Cambria County, Pennsylvania struggled to solve the murder of 15-year-old Micah Pollock, whose bullet-ridden and tattered body was discovered in a remote pond. Though all of the circumstantial evidence pointed to 16-year-old Andrew Callahan as the killer, Pennsylvania State Police had little physical evidence to prove it. Their last hope for making their case fell to forensic scientists at the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab. Examiner Bruce Tackett looked for consistencies between the rope found tied around the victim's ankles and the samples collected from the suspect's residence.
When I did the rope comparison in this case, I determined that the ropes were a clothesline type rope. They had a woven or a braided cover over top of a core of fairly coarse man-made fibers. I examined all 3 of those pieces of rope that I had, determined that the construction on all of those was exactly the same.
For proof that all of the samples had originated from the same source, Tackett needed to examine the construction of the rope's core. Under a high-powered microscope, he found that the fibers that made up the core were all indistinguishable from one another.
I was able to determine that those ropes were identical in construction and that the fibers used in the construction of those ropes were the same. So essentially, those 3 pieces of rope were identical.
The rope used to bind Micah Pollock's feet had come from the same source as the rope tied to Andrew Callahan's car.
We have all this evidence against you.
When confronted with the evidence, Andrew Callahan decided to talk. He admitted that he had shot Micah while the 2 were hunting. He claimed that when the shooting occurred, he was tracking a bird as it flew into some nearby brush. He believed his gun was positioned at a downward angle. He didn't notice that Micah, who had been standing some distance away, was in his line of fire. Afraid that police wouldn't believe his story, he said he panicked and tried to get rid of the body.
premises, we have found the rope.
Looking to corroborate the suspect's story, police turned to the evidence for answers.
And found on the front porch.
From powder burns observed on Micah's body, the medical examiner concluded that the gun was no more than 3 feet away when it discharged. And the shotgun pellets that entered the victim's back came to rest near his jaw. The weapon had been held at an upward angle, contradicting Callahan's claim that he had been aiming at the ground when Micah was shot. Police believe that Callahan went hunting that day with only one target in mind.
I got another one over there up on the hill there last year, and there's this
the teenager
down this
who was
way.
now dating his ex-girlfriend. Pennsylvania State Police Detective Greg Batcher believed that after the shooting, Andrew systematically went about covering up his actions.
He purchased the garbage can at the store and then returned to the scene. At some point in time, he also gathered a piece of clothesline from his residence. He took these items to the scene, back to where the body was lying.
But when Micah Pollock's body wouldn't fit in the garbage can, he used rope to drag the body some 400 feet behind his car until he reached a remote spot. 16-year-old Andrew Callahan was tried as an adult. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Police believe that irrational jealousy drove Andrew Callahan to murder his rival. But sometimes, investigators can find no motive at all. A suburb of Seattle, the Woodbridge section of Bellevue, Washington, is a quiet neighborhood. One that is unfamiliar with brutal crime. On January 5th, 1997, a morning 911 call brought Bellevue police to a secluded park. A passerby had discovered the lifeless body of a young woman. A rope fastened tightly around the victim's neck made it clear she had been murdered. Police began searching for any form of identification to tell them who this victim was.
No other visible signs of injury.
Lying near the body, they found a checkbook. The account was in the name of Karen White, and it listed a San Diego address. Bellevue police searched through records looking for a Karen White who matched the victim's description. Homicide detective Jeff Gomes found a potential match. A 20-year-old woman with that name and physical description listed a previous address just a few blocks from the park where the body was found. After confirming it was the same Karen White that had been found murdered, Detective Gomes had the grim task of making the notification.
As a detective, one of the most difficult tasks you have is notifying next of kin of a death in their family. I don't enjoy it. It's very difficult to do.
Several hours after the body was recovered, detectives went to the White home. Though several cars were parked in the driveway, the house was dark. No one appeared to be home. Detectives discovered an unlocked door. Fearing that someone could be in danger, one of the officers entered the property. The house was eerily silent. It appeared the residence had been robbed. After finding no one downstairs, the detective proceeded to the upper floors. As he approached a bedroom, he noticed bloodstains on the outside of the door. When he looked inside, he discovered the lifeless body of a teenage girl. She had been viciously beaten and stabbed to death. He yelled for his partner to call in for backup. Next, he followed a trail of blood that led down the hall into another room. There, he found another grisly scene. A middle-aged couple lay dead. Their skulls had been crushed, and they had been stabbed repeatedly. The victims were later identified as 17-year-old Janet White and her parents, Regina and Walter White. They were the immediate family of the young woman found murdered in the park just hours earlier. Forensic technicians began searching for clues to help them reconstruct what happened. All of the victims had been savagely beaten with a blunt object and then stabbed dozens of times in the face and neck. Police photographed and swabbed dozens of bloodstains. The only real clues to the killer's identity were bloody boot prints found on the carpet and one on the back of Walter White's shirt. Though the triple murder at the White residence appeared to be the result of a robbery gone bad, that didn't explain the murder of Karen White just a few blocks away.
Well, just the area around the water tower, the picnic area and stuff, there looked like there's some activity of people being up there, but we don't know if it's related to the crime or not. There's not a whole bunch of stuff.
In a community that witnessed few homicides, police were convinced that finding an entire family murdered in one day was more than a coincidence.
The main question was, are these scenes connected? Was that the same suspect acting in both scenes? Was it a one-time incident where a person killed this family, or was it a serial killer?
Despite the lingering questions, police were faced with the reality that at least one brutal killer was on the loose in the city of Bellevue. And until they could identify a suspect or an apparent motive, police were powerless to stop him from killing again. While searching for answers in the strangulation murder of 20-year-old Karen White, Bellevue, Washington police made a shocking discovery. A few blocks away from where her body was found, detectives discovered that her parents, Regina and Walter White, and her 17-year-old sister Janet had been brutally beaten and stabbed to death in their home. Police focused their investigation on Karen's murder, believing that her killer was responsible for the other 3 homicides. Through interviews, investigators learned that before Karen moved to San Diego to become a volunteer in the AmeriCorps program, she associated with a tightly knit group of teenagers who were part of a movement referred to as goth.
It's young teenagers dressing all in black, painting their faces white, dyeing their hair. They sometimes pretend to be vampires with fang teeth, and they dress the part. Witches, they pretend to be witches.
Police learned that one of those friends had seen Karen the night before her body was discovered. The friend had stopped by the White residence. Karen had come back to Bellevue for a few days to visit her family. That night, Karen wanted to run out and do some last-minute errands before returning to San Diego the following day.
See y'all later.
After being dropped off at home a few hours later, Karen said she still had one more errand to run. She wanted to see a teenager named David Anderson, who owed her some money. The friend decided not to go along. Police jumped on the lead. Under questioning, David Anderson, a 17-year-old high school student, confirmed he and Karen White were friends. But he said he hadn't seen her since she had come back into town. On the night of the murder, he stated he was at a friend's house all night. He and his friend never left. When asked if he owned any boots, Anderson said he had one pair and retrieved them for the detective. But it was clear that the sole pattern on his boots did not resemble the bloody prints recovered from the victim's residence. Frustrated, investigators continued interviewing Karen White's friends. One believed she had important information. She said that on the night of the murders, David Anderson had been at her apartment hanging out with her roommate. Around 10 p.m., Anderson and her roommate, 17-year-old Alex Barani, decided to go out. She recalled that Alex had something stuffed inside the sleeve of his overcoat. She thought it was a bat or a club. The woman fell asleep a short while later and was unsure what time the two returned to the apartment. Having caught David Anderson in a lie, police turned to his friend Alex Barani for additional information. Alex was cooperative and even friendly with police. He insisted he and David had been home all night. But when detectives confronted him with his roommate's statements, his demeanor changed. Homicide detective Bob Thompson.
His chin began to quiver. He immediately started sweating, and he became visibly nervous. I, at that time, decided, I think this guy did the murder.
Under persistent questioning, Alex Barani unraveled. The 17-year-old confessed to all 4 murders. He said after leaving the apartment, he dropped David Anderson off at his girlfriend's house and then went to the park alone to meet Karen White. He planned to tell Karen that David would be unable to pay back the money he owed her. On his way there, he decided he wanted to know what it was like to kill. He strangled the young woman. Fearing that Karen had told her parents her plans, Alex went to her home and bludgeoned and stabbed the family to death. Alex Barani said he had thrown away his boots that had left the prints found at the crime scene.
You have the right to remain silent.
He was placed under arrest and charged with the 4 murders. Though Alex had confessed to the murders, investigators knew from experience that they still needed to scientifically corroborate his statements. And they were unconvinced that he had acted alone. All of the crime scene photographs from the White's residence were sent to renowned blood spatter expert Ross Gardner in Georgia. Gardner looked to reconstruct the triple murder, one droplet of blood at a time.
Most of your forensic evidence tells you who was involved in a crime. But what happened at the crime and how it happened is sometimes very significant. And bloodstain patterns speak to those events that created the bloodstains. They tell us what happened and how it happened.
Using bloodstain patterns observed in the photographs, Gardner first looked to establish what types of weapons had been used in the murders. He recognized 2 distinct cast-off patterns. The first type of pattern was consistent with having been caused by sharp force trauma, most likely by the blade of a knife.
The size of the stains are very small, and here in particular, very similar to what we saw on the scene. And the reason being is we have a very thin edge on which the blood can accumulate as it's being cast off.
A larger, blunt instrument made the second type of bloodstain pattern that Gardner identified.
If we were to observe a cast-off that is the result of a club or a bloody hand being swung, something like that, we're going to see a significantly different kind of cast-off. We're going to see larger stains, greater volume, and they're going to develop over a little bit wider area.
Next, Gardner set out to understand the sequence of events inside the master bedroom. His first clue came from the tiny bloodstains found on the back of Walter White's t-shirt. Those stains had originated from his wife, Regina. That suggested that she had been the first victim, attacked in the couple's bed while her husband lay sleeping beside her.
The father had his back to his wife as she was being attacked in the very early stages of the blunt force attack, because it was very tiny spatter that impacted on the back of his t-shirt.
To understand what happened next, Gardner entered the coordinates of all of the bloodstains found in the room into a computer database. Then, specially designed forensic software was applied to the data. The location and pattern of the father's blood found next to the bed suggested he was attacked with a knife as he tried to get up. A trail of his blood led from that spot to the foot of the bed, where his body finally came to rest. There, more of the father's blood was found spattered on the walls, indicating he came under attack a second time. Those cast-off patterns had been caused by both a knife and a blunt object.
When we took the combination of all the stains that were found in this corner, it really demanded, there was really no other explanation but that this spatter event was occurring and the sharp force was occurring from the other side.
The stains indicated that the attacker stood in front of the victim's head when beating him with a blunt object, which caused his blood to eject into the scene in a radiating pattern. But Gardner found no blood spatter on the surface of one section of wall. The only explanation for the finding was that there was a second attacker standing in front of that wall. Lastly, the blood evidence showed that 17-year-old Janet rushed to her parents' room, but then was attacked and then dragged back to her room, where she became the final victim. Gardner's analysis was consistent with Alex Barani's confession, with one major exception. He had not acted alone. And investigators believed that Alex was protecting his friend, David Anderson. Police obtained a warrant to search the vehicle David Anderson had driven on the night of the murders. They found a length of rope on the front seat. Forensic examiners concluded that it was the same type of rope used to strangle 20-year-old Karen White. David Anderson was also charged with 4 counts of murder. Police believe that David Anderson and Alex Barani murdered Karen White at the park, motivated by sick curiosity. They next set their sights on the victim's entire family. Based on their complete disregard for human life, Alex Barani and David Anderson were tried as adults. Both received 4 consecutive life sentences. In Washington state, analysis of the crime scene helped expose a second killer's identity. But when police are unable to locate a victim's body, proving murder is much more difficult. In the late afternoon hours of November 10, 1995, Rhonda Mitchie entered the Phoenix Police Department to report her child missing. She hadn't heard from her 13-year-old son, Brad Hansen, in nearly 12 hours. Though Brad was a responsible and loving son, he seemed to be going through a rebellious phase.
He's 13 years old. He was on a bike.
In fact, Brad had been recently grounded, and he was supposed to come straight home after school. After saying goodbye to him earlier that morning, Rhonda, a single mom, went to work. She later learned that there were no classes that day. She called Brad's pager and contacted several of his friends. But the 13-year-old never called back, and his friends hadn't seen him that day. Detective Sally Dillion agreed to look into the case. She was optimistic that there would be a quick resolution.
We thought he'd ran away from home, that he was staying with a friend, and, you know, that in a day or two, 3, that he would return home.
But after several days went by without a word, authorities several hundred miles away in California were dispatched to the home of Brad Hansen's father. Investigators hoped they would find the boy there. But Mr. Hansen had not heard from Brad in some time, and he was troubled that his son had not checked in. Phoenix police distributed photographs and a description of the missing boy throughout the area. But no clues to his whereabouts surfaced. A search of the desert and mountain areas outside of Phoenix also turned up nothing. Brad Hansen seemed to have vanished without a trace. Police in Phoenix, Arizona continued searching for 13-year-old Brad Hansen, who had been reported missing by his mother. Having uncovered no clues to the boy's whereabouts, detectives began questioning his classmates. Brad's girlfriend, Jennifer, said that on the day he disappeared, she went over to a friend's house to hang out. Brad was also supposed to be there. But when Jennifer arrived at her friend Jeremy Bach's house, she learned Brad was no longer there. He had left his favorite ski cap behind. Then, in the kitchen, she noticed a hole in the wall. There was also a reddish-brown stain on the floor. 13-year-old Jeremy told her that he and Brad had been playing cops and robbers with his stepfather's guns. Not knowing that the guns were loaded, Jeremy said that Brad pulled the trigger, firing a round into the wall. The stain on the floor, he said, was ketchup. Jeremy told Jennifer that after the gun went off, Brad rushed out of the house, afraid that he would get into trouble. He didn't know where Brad went, and he hadn't heard from him since. Jennifer hadn't heard from him either. Investigators arranged to interview Jeremy Bach and his stepfather. Jeremy told the same story he had relayed to his friend, Jennifer. But when pressed on specific details, Detective Sally Dillion sensed that he wasn't telling the entire truth.
There were parts of it that we had a notion were probably going to be true, and other parts that you could tell weren't. Times when he would make the eye contact and other times when he wouldn't.
As investigators struggled to figure out what Jeremy was hiding, word came in that another classmate wanted to speak with police. In the principal's office at the nearby junior high school, police questioned one of the missing boy's friends. He believed that Jeremy Bach had done something to Brad Hansen. It was well known around school that Brad and Jennifer were boyfriend and girlfriend. And it was also known that Jeremy was extremely jealous. He also liked Jennifer. And though he and Brad were friends, Jeremy tried to break up the young couple's relationship. According to the classmate, Jeremy had been bragging that he was going to hurt Brad. Investigators feared Jeremy Bach had made good on his threat. But to prove that a crime had been committed, they needed to locate the victim's body.
Kevin's gonna meet us down there.
To do that, they struggled to put themselves inside the mind of a 13-year-old killer, one who didn't have access to a car.
We really had nothing, so we tried to figure out what we could do, and the only thing that we came up with is we put him in the trash.
Detectives formulated a plan. Once a dumpster is put out on the curb, it is considered public property in the eyes of the law. 2 weeks after Brad Hansen was reported missing, police returned to the Bach residence. After the trash was put on the curb, investigators confiscated the can and then replaced it with another one. Once the trash can was secured in an evidence property room, Detective Dillian contacted forensic examiners at the Phoenix Police Department's crime lab. As soon as the lid was opened, investigators knew their instincts had been dead on. Large stains and dried liquid pooled in the bottom tested positive for human blood. And forensic scientist Kevin Knapp didn't believe anyone could have survived such blood loss without immediate medical attention.
The dumpster is probably about 2 feet in diameter, and there was probably about an inch deep pool of blood, dried blood, in the bottom of the dumpster. So even without being a medical examiner, in my opinion, it was an awful lot of blood, more than I typically see in a case.
Now, examiners needed to verify that the blood found inside the trash can had originated from 13-year-old Brad Hansen. But there were no DNA samples from Brad to use for comparisons. Knapp had another option to get the evidence he needed.
We all get our DNA from our parents. We get half from our mother and half from our father. So you can look at a DNA profile from an offspring and determine whether or not the DNA pattern from the parents could have formed that child.
When the DNA samples collected from the trash can were compared to the genetic profiles of Brad's parents, examiners found a match. Detectives confronted the 13-year-old suspect with their findings. Now, Jeremy Bach claimed that while playing cops and robbers, his hand accidentally hit the countertop and the gun he was holding discharged. Sending Brad Hansen flying backwards into the wall. He didn't realize that his finger was on the trigger. Panicked, he cleaned up the blood and disposed of the body. For investigators, Jeremy's story stretched credibility.
He had said that when Brad was hit by the bullet that he flew back and he hit the wall. Well, very seldom does someone fly back. That's movies. Okay, that's theatrics. Normally when somebody gets shot by a bullet, they drop. So there were things that he was recounting to us that we did not feel were totally accurate.
Detectives returned to the Bach residence with a search warrant. They collected the 2 handguns that Jeremy's stepfather kept in the house, including the .357 Magnum revolver used in the shooting. And though investigators found traces of Brad Hansen's blood in the kitchen, the findings did little to refute Jeremy's claim that the shooting was accidental. As long as investigators were unable to locate the victim's body, proving murder would be difficult. Blood evidence convinced Phoenix police that missing 13-year-old Brad Hansen was dead. Though they had been unable to locate his body, his classmate, Jeremy Bach, claimed that he accidentally shot the boy while they played cops and robbers. In a panic, he said he disposed of Brad's body in the trash. But investigators suspected that Brad Hansen had been murdered out of jealousy. Now they needed to prove it. Police turned to forensic examiners for help. At the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab, firearms expert Mahesh Patel looked for evidence that could prove whether or not the shooting was an accident.
The scenario that was given to me was that Jeremy might have struck the side of the edge of the table and might have accidentally discharged the firearm.
The .357 was constructed with a hammer block, which is designed to prevent it from discharging if accidentally dropped or bumped. Though incriminating, that didn't prove that Jeremy had intentionally fired the weapon. Patel needed to determine how much force had to be applied to the trigger in order to fire the weapon.
What we do is take a set of weights and hang them from the trigger and keep adding on weight to the end of the trigger till it actually goes off, and that will tell us how much force was required for that particular firearm.
Patel determined that 10 1/4 pounds of pressure was required to fire the .357 Magnum revolver. He concluded that an accidental flinch would not have been enough to cause the gun to fire. The analysis indicated that Jeremy Bach intentionally pulled the trigger. 13-year-old Jeremy Bach was placed under arrest and charged with murder. Authorities believe that Jeremy invited his friend Brad Hansen to his house and then confronted him about Brad and Jennifer's blossoming relationship. Driven by a jealous rage, Jeremy grabbed his stepfather's gun and shot Brad. Jeremy Bach, the youngest person to be tried as an adult in the state of Arizona, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison. Brad Hansen's body has never been found. Sometimes, juveniles believe that homicide is the answer to their problems. When that happens, investigators and forensic scientists must focus on the facts, which can turn dreams of a promising future into the reality of a wasted youth. In a small town outside of Fort Worth, Texas, a truck driver leaves home, never to return. Authorities suspect something is terribly wrong. Weeks pass as forensic investigators search for even the smallest clues, only to find what they feared in their own backyard. In Canada, 2 people die suddenly of unknown causes, and their deaths may not be as coincidental as they first appear. But a mixture of intuition and science leads detectives on a journey to uncover the deadly answers half a world away. Perpetrators try to disguise their actions to avoid prosecution. Yet forensic investigators, using advanced techniques, can uncover their crimes, revealing the silent killers. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Graham, Texas lies in the grasslands just west of Fort Worth. The quaint cowboy town, surrounded by cattle and horse ranches, has a down-home family feel, where picturesque scenery rarely doubles as a crime scene. On January 20th, 1996, the Young County Sheriff's Office received a call from T.J. Ryan's parents.
You need police, fire, or ambulance?
Their son was missing, and they were concerned. The 6'6", 300-pound, 27-year-old man had disappeared into thin air.
Wednesday. He's been missing since Wednesday.
Okay, does he have a girlfriend?
T.J.'s mother informed police that her son worked as a long-haul trucker transporting cattle.
She said that they had an argument.
She was worried because he had not reported to work for several days.
I don't believe that because he would have come to my house.
Young County Sheriff Kerry Pettis was the first to look into T.J.'s whereabouts. Sheriff Pettis knew most of the county's citizens, so he was acquainted with the easygoing trucker.
He was a good person. He was a young man that rodeoed, drove cattle trucks, helped gather cattle. He just worked around agriculture all his life. Was the same as any young person is. Always wore a big hat, always wore boots, generally speaking.
Since it was out of character for TJ to miss work without checking in, police hoped his employer might have some information about his whereabouts.
How many years?
TJ's boss told him his girlfriend, Helen Moore, had phoned a few days earlier, explaining he was too sick to come in to work.
Because he lives with his girlfriend.
So we began the process of following up. Did he have girlfriends? Did he have a drug habit? Where could he have gone?
The sheriff put out a missing persons report to the surrounding areas in hopes of some news about the missing trucker.
On Monday, we began, as word got out in the community, we began getting hundreds of calls of, well, I saw him here. I think he went there. So on and so forth. And those things had to all be run down, and it was very time-consuming.
The sheriff met with Chief Deputy Gary Barnett to discuss the case. He also called in Texas Ranger Marshall Brown, who worked for the district attorney's office handling special cases. Together, they focused on finding T.J. Ryan. Since T.J.'s boss said Helen Moore called in sick on her boyfriend's behalf, Ranger Brown and Deputy Barnett decided to pay her a visit. Helen and T.J. lived together on a small ranch where they kept some livestock and a few horses.
Gary Barnett, Chief Deputy, Young County Sheriff's Department.
The couple had been involved for over 5 years.
Talk to us.
Sure.
Helen told the officers that she and T.J. were arguing over finances.
About 4 days ago.
She said he stormed out of the house and she hadn't seen him since.
Shirt, I think.
She told Ranger Brown this wasn't the first time something like this had happened.
He always comes back, though. He'll be back.
At the house, Ranger Brown noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on the front porch. Helen became agitated and quickly explained that a stray dog had attacked their pet pot-bellied pig.
Yeah, the blood's from our pig.
The pig's wounds were so severe that he could not be saved. She asked her son to shoot it.
Where's Pig at?
Helen then told the officers that she had placed the carcass in a horse trailer.
Do you mind if we...
Ranger Brown wanted to look around inside.
I don't mind.
Would you go with us?
Sure.
Okay.
Although everything appeared to be in order, one thing caught his eye. He noticed the floor. It looked as if the carpet had been removed.
I took it out and burned it.
Helen said the carpet was one of the things she and TJ were arguing over.
Complaining how messy the house is. What is the problem?
She said he yelled at her because the carpet was filthy and that she was a bad housekeeper. She wanted to make him happy, so she tore it up and took it outside. She explained that the carpeting was too heavy to drag to the side of the road, so she thought it would be easier to burn it.
Yeah, why don't you clean the house up once in a while? Was there something on the carpet that you didn't want us to see?
Well, no, I don't care if y'all saw it. We had the
Helen denied any wrongdoing. She simply was getting rid of some old carpet.
About how messy the carpet was, so I just took it outside and burned it.
Investigators had come up empty at the ranch. They were no closer to finding TJ Ryan. But that was about to change. In neighboring Palo Pinto County, a resident of the Possum Lake area called authorities. He saw what he believed to be a deer carcass shot by poachers hiding on his land. Constable Noah Bragg was dispatched to the scene. He was horrified by what he saw in the scrubby prairie grass.
.1156 Palo Pinto, going to need the sheriff and the investigator here, please. We've got human remains.
Hello?
Constable Bragg reported the torso was that of a large white male.
Okay, we'll be on our way. Be there in a minute. Marshal, we gotta go.
Barnett and Brown immediately left for the crime scene, fearing their missing person case had now become a murder. When they arrived, Palo Pinto police had already roped off the area. Investigators noticed something strange right away. There wasn't a large amount of blood around the torso. Given the severity of the dismemberment, officers speculated that the victim had most likely been killed somewhere else and then dumped in the grass. Further examination of the torso revealed even more clues. They believed whoever cut up this body knew something about anatomy. The legs and buttocks had been removed at the joint. The hands were detached at the wrists in the same manner. The victim's head and neck were also missing. Investigators noticed an abrasion around the victim's waist. Ranger Brown had several initial theories.
In a drug-related crime, they do dismember bodies to keep the body from being identified. And in this case, that's what it appeared to be in.
The torso was removed and sent to the coroner's office for an autopsy. Investigators would have to wait for DNA tests before they would know if, in fact, this was the body of TJ Ryan. In Young County, Texas, a trucker named TJ Ryan was reported missing. A few days later, a dismembered torso was discovered in a remote field in nearby Palo Pinto County. Investigators speculated the gruesome murder might be a result of a drug deal gone bad. And now they waited for DNA results in the hopes of making a positive identification to see if, in fact, it was the missing trucker. At the scene, investigators gathered more clues. They noticed coastal Bermuda hay, a commonly used stock feed, around the torso. Smears of manure were present, as were prickly pear needles. They collected these samples for further analysis. Texas Ranger Brown and his team found other peculiar clues.
There was a black plastic bag laying next to the torso. Also, there was a piece of wood that was found at the scene that had red paint on it, which appeared that the vehicle had ran over and maybe the paint from the vehicle was on the wood. And that was basically the physical evidence that was at the scene.
Officers noticed tire impressions in the loose soil. There were two separate and distinct sets of tire tracks. It appeared as if a truck pulling a trailer had driven up near the torso. While the soil was too powdery to obtain imprint samples, the officers documented the size and characteristics of the tire treads. They also measured the tracks to determine the turning radius of the vehicle. At the Dallas County Medical Examiner's office, the torso was processed. Pathologists made a detailed report of the victim's wounds. They determined that a knife or a fine-tooth saw was used to dismember the body. They also believed the abrasion across the victim's waist was caused by a rope. DNA samples were collected to help determine if, in fact, this was the body of T.J. Ryan. They were sent out for analysis. Investigators also sent the biological samples to the lab for further toxicology screenings in hopes of proving their drug theory. But what the lab proved shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The lab report informed Sheriff Pettis there were fatal levels of morphine in the victim's body. But no one knew whose torso they were investigating. The answer lay deep within the body's DNA, but the test results were days away. Investigators continued to search for other body parts and additional evidence. Search and rescue teams combed the surrounding areas where the torso was found. Forensic cadaver dogs, specially trained to alert on human remains, were also called in to aid in the search. Despite this effort, no further evidence was found. At the Torrent County Medical Examiner's office, senior forensic DNA analyst Carolyn Van Winkle used a reverse paternity test to make a positive identification on T.J. Ryan. Sheriff Pettis was now officially heading up a murder investigation. And he decided to go back to the last known person who saw T.J. Ryan alive, his girlfriend, Helen Moore. He needed answers. Sheriff Pettis wanted to take another look at the ranch. He was particularly interested in the blood on the porch, which Moore said came from an injured pig. Crime scene investigators took samples of the blood. Since Helen said she transported the pig in the horse trailer, Pettis moved it to the impound lot. Investigators would make a more detailed inspection at the police lab.
This is Carolyn Van.
Carolyn Van Winkle examined the blood samples taken from the porch.
That blood came back to be pig blood. It wasn't human.
Van Winkle's test confirmed the sample taken from the porch was in fact from a pig. It appeared that Helen Moore was not lying. But investigators were still not convinced she was telling the whole truth. They believed she was holding back something. They just didn't know what it was. The Young County forensic team examined the truck and trailer taken from Helen's ranch. They discovered prickly pine needles embedded in the tires. Investigators collected samples in order to compare it to similar plant material found where the torso had been left. Knowing horse manure was also present near the remains, they also gathered manure samples. Inside the samples were visible specks of red that appeared to be chips of paint. They were sent to the lab for analysis. Once again, Vi Hummel-Carr brought in a cadaver dog to determine if a human body was transported in the trailer.
We were requested to do an evidence search of the trailer to see if we could determine if there was any blood or tissue from the victim. I started out doing a perimeter search of the trailer with Mercy, and then we went inside the trailer where she alerted on the floorboards.
The dog confirmed what investigators were beginning to suspect.
The blood was found in the trailer boards and on the axles of the trailer. It had dripped down through the cracks in the boards and come to rest on the axles.
Investigators sent the boards to the lab to see if the blood was human or if it came from the dead pig Helen's son had placed in the trailer. Given that red paint flecks were found in the manure next to the torso, they also extracted paint samples for further analysis. The truck and trailer's turning radius was compared to the calculations taken at the crime scene. Investigators determined that Helen's truck and trailer could have been at the crime scene, but definitive proof was needed. Nothing tied her directly to the murder. Investigators went back to those closest to TJ. Sheriff Pettis looked into Helen Moore's finances.
Hey, let me see it. Hey, Gary, come here and look at this.
The most alarming piece of information was the fact that Helen Moore had recently taken out a $150,000 insurance policy on the life of her boyfriend, TJ Ryan.
Nobody has that kind of claims history.
Investigators now believe they were closer to a suspect.
There's your motive.
If they ever hoped to make an arrest, they needed the science to back up their suspicions. At the forensic lab, Dr. Tam Garland examined the paint scrapings taken from the floorboards of the trailer. They compared these to the red paint flecks embedded in the manure where the torso had been found.
We have found what we believe are red paint chips inside the fecal pads. And so he actually retrieved paint chips from the trailer for us, and we could lay them side by side and match up the different colors. You could match up the colors layer for layer in the chips that he sent us as well as in the chips that we found from the cows. So in our mind, that's pretty much reduces the probability that it's from any other trailer or from any other source.
Dr. Garland determined the cow had eaten the paint chips found in the grass and passed them. Helen's trailer had been at the scene. Forensic examiner Carolyn Van Winkle extracted blood samples from the trailer floorboards. Her analysis revealed the presence of two distinct blood types.
In the trailer, there was samples obtained from the floorboards of the trailer and samples obtained from under those floorboards in the axle of the trailer. Those samples were submitted to the laboratory, and on each one of those samples, human blood was identified, and also pig blood was identified.
Further DNA analysis confirmed that the human blood belonged to TJ Ryan. Sheriff Pettis now had definitive proof that the trailer on Helen Moore's property had transported Ryan's body. He had the evidence he needed to secure an arrest warrant. Helen Moore was arrested and charged with murder. But Sheriff Pettis still needed corroborating evidence that would confirm exactly what had happened. He obtained a search warrant, and his team began a detailed examination of Helen and TJ's ranch house. Investigators used luminol testing to check for blood. It became quickly apparent that Moore had used bleach to scrub the house, erasing any residual surface stains. Any evidence that placed the murder in her home appeared to be gone. Yet when a cadaver dog was brought in, it alerted on evidence the luminol testing could not pick up. This just might be the link detectives needed that would firmly establish where and how the murder took place.
Yeah, I'll see what you got there.
Detectives in Young County, Texas had apprehended Helen Moore, charging her with the murder of her boyfriend, TJ Ryan. His torso had been found in a remote area, and forensic investigators learned he had toxic levels of morphine in his system. Police discovered TJ's blood in a horse trailer found on Moore's property. Detectives believed Moore had scrubbed her house with bleach, and luminol testing could not reveal exactly where the murder took place. Once again, Vi Hummel Carr brought in a cadaver dog to help find what investigators were looking for.
Inside the Moore residence, Mercy alerted on blood evidence by the rear door, where apparently the body had been dragged through the house. She trailed from the master bedroom through the hallway and into the boys' room, just the way the body had been dragged through the house.
The dog had sensed something underneath a carpet threshold strip. Investigators removed the carpet strip to examine it further in the lab. Inside the residence, they also found prescription bottles of morphine. Pettis learned later that Helen's former husband had cancer. The drug had been prescribed as a painkiller. At the lab, the blood samples taken from the carpet strip were analyzed. The blood was TJ Ryan's. Sheriff Pettis was now convinced Helen Moore murdered TJ Ryan inside their home for the insurance money. He confronted her with a possible motive.
She was wanting to purchase another horse and wanted to borrow the money again to do this, and he said no. And I think that may have been the trigger that really set her off. I think she was probably going to do it all along, but I think that set her off.
But Helen admitted nothing. Finally, Pettis showed her the evidence his team had collected. He told her that given these irrefutable facts, the district attorney would seek the death penalty. Realizing her crime had been revealed, Helen Moore told the sheriff what had transpired that fateful night. TJ complained of back pain, and Helen suggested he take some morphine. She gave him a lethal dose. With her kids away at school, Helen proceeded to get rid of the body. But because TJ was over 300 pounds, it would be impossible for her to drag him outside by herself. So she wrapped a lariat around his waist and attached it to the hitch on her pickup. She then proceeded to pull the body out of the house and up into the trailer. Moore, who had experienced butchering animals, then cut up the body in the trailer and discarded the parts over 3 counties. Helen Moore was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison and will not be eligible for parole for 30 years. Some find their prey and methods of murder close to home. Other perpetrators travel far and wide to uncover the perfect silent killer. Hamilton, Ontario sits on the northern shores of Lake Ontario. This Canadian city is home to an international population. And in 1996, authorities would discover an exotic method of murder. John Pierce, an insurance investigator, went to the home of Natraj Sukhwinder, a native of India. Pierce needed some additional information to process a recent life insurance claim. As he got out of his car, Pierce felt as if he'd been at this location before. Ranjit Kela, his client, had died a few weeks ago of a heart attack and named Mr. Sukhwinder the beneficiary of his $100,000 life insurance policy.
Hello. Sir. Yes, I'm John Pierce. I'm the insurance.
Both men purchased policies naming the other as beneficiary in the event of their deaths.
Thank you. This is what, sir. Yes, ma'am. I'd like to ask you a few
Sukhwinder told the agent that Ranjit was his nephew and that the young man had lived with him. Pierce was confused. Ranjit's driver's license listed a different address.
Oh, he's my nephew.
Sukhwinder explained that the address was his brother's and that his nephew spent time at both houses. Pierce left the documents with Sukhwinder, who said his brother was in India and he would have him clear up any discrepancies once he returned. As Pierce drove away, something about the case still bothered him. Back at his office, Pierce asked his assistant to pull Sukhwinder's file. As he went through the information, Pierce remembered Sukhwinder had filed another life insurance claim only 16 months earlier. The claim was for Sukhwinder's wife, Priya. She too had died suddenly. Instinctively, he called the Hamilton police. Detective Warren Corral was the lead investigator. Kevin Dinsa, a native of India who spoke fluent Punjabi, was also assigned to the case.
I've interviewed the beneficiary.
The fact that 2 claims were filed in such a relatively short period of time and were purchased by the same individual raised serious concerns.
I understand that you represent 2 separate insurance.
Detective Corral was very suspicious.
That's why I contacted
Both of the people that died had similar symptomology to their deaths. They were young people who had no medical history.
The report indicated that Priya had complained of headaches for several weeks before her death. She was taking a homeopathic remedy to help alleviate the pain. One day, she suddenly collapsed. Her husband, Natraj Sukhwinder, found her and immediately called 911. Doctors could not revive her, and she lapsed into a coma.
Do you really want to go through with this?
4 days later, at her husband's request, her life support was removed and she died. Dr. David King performed the autopsy on Priya. He was somewhat puzzled by what he found.
Postmortem showed
really a swollen brain, of brain death. And that was about the only significant finding at post-mortem. There was no actual indication of why she had collapsed, no underlying disease process that I could identify at that time.
The hospital drug screen found no trace of street drugs. Cause of death was ruled undetermined. Sukhwinder had his wife's remains cremated and sent back to India. Unfortunately, the autopsy did not provide the answers Detective Coral had hoped for. He decided to look into Sukhwinder's past. A search in the Canadian criminal database revealed that Sukhwinder was arrested for domestic violence. He had hit Priya. He paid a fine and was released. Detectives Coral and Dinsa decided to look into Sukhwinder's nephew's death. They began by visiting Ranjit's widow to ask about the night her husband died. She explained that Ranjit had friends over that day, including his uncle, Sukhwinder. Ranjit's friends were partying and drinking heavily. But his wife told the detectives Ranjit never drank alcohol, and this night was no exception. She remembered when the guests left, he had complained of a backache and took some pills to alleviate the pain. As he was getting ready for bed, he collapsed. She said she called an ambulance as her husband convulsed on the floor. Hello? Ranjit died in the emergency room. The official cause of death? Heart failure.
Well, thank you for the information.
Although his death was ruled a heart attack, Ranjit, like Priya, the first victim, had experienced severe pain, taken medicine, and collapsed on the floor. The detectives went to see Dr. King at Hamilton General. Dr. King's colleague, Dr. Chitra Rao, overheard the detectives' questions and had particular concerns of her own, given the peculiar cause of death.
We discussed the case, and then he asked me whether I had any suggestion. So then I realized, since both are Indian origin, and I know three common poisonings in India is strychnine, arsenic, and chloroform. So I said maybe we should test for those three agents.
Detective Coral wondered if, in fact, the victims had been given the deadly poison.
Now, these are the...
Dr. King, the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsies, gave Detective Coral the tissue samples from the two victims, Priya Sukhwinder and Ranjit Kela. Coral delivered these to the Center of Forensic Science for further toxicology testing. But they would have to wait for the results. It took time. Given Dr. Rao's concerns, Coral began researching strychnine poisoning. He learned that the plant it comes from is indigenous to India. Because it is used as a pesticide and a homeopathic medicine, the substance is readily available. The toxic chemical is lethal and is banned in Canada. A small amount, 1/40th of a sugar cube, is enough to cause a horrific death.
It's just a terrible, terrible death. You're conscious while this goes on, while you're in these seizures, these state of seizures, and you basically know that there's impending doom. People that have ingested strychnine will say, "I'm going to die, I'm going to die."
Yeah, I'm Warren Coral.
The detectives went to visit the friend who was drinking with Ranjit and Sukhwinder.
We're investigating the...
Although he said he noticed nothing unusual the night Ranjit died, he did remember Sukhwinder gave his nephew a pill for his back pain. He then told the officers he heard a rumor that Suckwinder went back to India after his wife Priya died and remarried there.
I haven't seen him.
And there was one more startling revelation.
Something is funny because
He also heard his new wife suddenly died, just like Ranjit and Priya. The friend believed Suckwinder had collected on insurance for this wife as well. 3 people were dead, and a pattern was beginning to emerge. In Hamilton, Ontario, 2 young Indian immigrants died suddenly for no apparent reason. The only link between them, one man, Natraj Suckwinder, the sole beneficiary of life insurance policies taken out on both victims.
Let me ask you this.
And although there were rumors surrounding Suckwinder, there was no evidence of any kind.
That's my brother's address.
The one solid lead was the toxicology screenings of the second victim, Ranjit Kela. The presence of a lethal poison, strychnine, was discovered. And although illegal in both the US and Canada, the substance is readily available in Suckwinder's native India. At the Center of Forensic Science, Dr. Joel Mayer examined the samples taken from both victims. Dr. King had saved blood samples from Ranjit. But because Priya had died nearly 18 months earlier, no blood remained, just small blocks of tissue. Due to the limitations of his equipment, Dr. Mayer could not detect the presence of strychnine in Priya's samples. However, he did find evidence of strychnine in Ranjit's blood sample. While Hamilton investigators now believed the young man was poisoned, proving it was another matter. And linking it to the death of Suckwinder's wife Priya was nearly impossible. They were convinced they had a killer who could strike again at any moment, and they had hit a dead end, fearful they wouldn't be able to stop him. Given the discovery of the poison, detectives Coral and Dinsa decided to question Suckwinder further. The used car dealer was cooperative at first, until they asked him if he had ever heard of the poison strychnine.
Death of Ranjit Kela.
Warren spoke to him in English, and it became progressively worse when some key questions were being asked of him. And that's when I stepped up and told him that I could speak Punjabi and that we could then speak in his mother tongue. And I don't think he was quite prepared for that, because he kind of got boxed in with that. And so when I was able to converse, he didn't have much room to back away from the questions at that point.
We're going to come back and chat with him.
Although Suckwinder said he visited with Ranjit the night he died, he insisted he never gave him a pill for his back pain. When they asked him about his wife, Priya, Suckwinder became sad.
I want you to think about the questions we've asked. I'll talk to you.
But detectives did not believe his display of emotion was genuine. His evasive answers only heightened their suspicions. But that alone was not enough evidence to hold him. The detectives wanted to check out the rumors surrounding Suckwinder. For that, they needed to go halfway around the world.
See if he's awake.
Coral and Dinsa placed a call to Pierre Carrier, the liaison officer at the Canadian High Commission in New Delhi, asking for information on Suckwinder's background.
Yes, I am. How were you able to follow up those?
Pierre Carrier sent them a fax from Interpol. The rumors proved to be true. Suckwinder's past was alarming.
What do you say?
He did remarry, and his new wife died suddenly, just like his first wife, Priya. They also learned he had 2 sons who died mysteriously shortly after they were born. It was possible that Suckwinder had not only killed another wife, but had also murdered his 2 infant sons as well.
February 16th, 1996.
Kind of confirms that information.
The trip to India also confirmed Suckwinder had easy access to strychnine, the poison found in his nephew's blood. Dinsa and Coral felt it was imperative that they travel to India to collect more corroborating evidence concerning his other family's death.
We wanted to determine what the cause of the death was and what the circumstances were. We also learned that the second wife that he had married in India gave birth to twin babies who had also died. So we wanted to determine what their cause of death was and what the circumstances were, and you know, what the connection was with all these deaths and marriages that were occurring immediately after the first wife's death.
They learned that the symptoms of the new wife's death were identical to those of Priya and Ranjit's. The detectives also discovered how easy it was to buy strychnine.
Strychnine is indigenous to India. It's a tree called kapilo tree, and it grows in the northeastern part of India, and it's available readily, and mainly used for homeopathic reasons, but it's also available in its raw form, and sometimes it's used to kill animals, and so it's quite readily available at some of the organic stores and homeopathic stores in India.
In order to get a conviction in Priya's case, Coral and Dinsa would need definitive proof that the poison was present in her tissue samples. It was their hope that forensic science would provide the link they were missing. Hamilton, Ontario detectives Coral and Dinsa were deep into the investigations of 5 mysterious deaths. They discovered strychnine in the blood of one of the victims and believed the others were poisoned as well. It seemed all the evidence was pointing to one suspect, Natraj Suckwinder, but linking him to the deadly substance proved difficult. The detectives contacted world-renowned Dr. Frederick Reeders, a Pennsylvania-based toxicologist who had advanced equipment calibrated to detect the most minute trace elements. Working with only the small tissue block sample obtained from Suckwinder's wife Priya, Reeders began a painstaking process. Using this method, Reeder was able to determine that a large amount of strychnine was in Priya's system at the time of her death. Coral and Dinsa now had the proof they needed to arrest Suckwinder for the murders of his nephew and his wife. Despite hours of interrogation, Suckwinder continued to maintain innocence.
He gave a caution statement again, stating he continued to say that he did not murder these people. He did not murder his first wife. He did not murder Ranjit. The things that were happening in India were all a coincidence.
Coral and Dinsa obtained a search warrant for his house. They discovered several items that supported the case they had pieced together. They were hoping to find something more substantial to tie him directly to the strychnine.
The search warrant was for strychnine or any literature related to strychnine, and we didn't find either. But what we did find was some mortar and pestles, which wasn't all that uncommon in Indian homes as spices are being ground for their daily consumption. However, it was our theory that raw strychnine, which comes in round brown pestles, was grounded in these mortar and pestles and then either placed in gelatin capsules and given to the victims.
The detectives submitted the evidence they collected to test for the poison. Yet Sukhwinder had covered his tracks. Dr. Mayer found no trace of strychnine. But the fact that these items were in his home, coupled with the other evidence they had compiled, gave the detectives a clear picture of how he carried out the crimes. Sukhwinder knew his wife was taking medication for her headaches. He ground up the strychnine in the mortar and pestle, then replaced the contents of her capsules with the deadly poison. He had also offered Ranjit a remedy for his back. Little did the man know the pills he took were laced with strychnine. In July of 2001, Sukhwinder was convicted of the murder of his wife. He received a life sentence. Later that year, he received an additional life term for the murder of Ranjit Kela.
It was an exhilarating experience. It was a tough fight, and once it was over, it was a very, very big victory for us, and it was a relief. Because of the problems that I've briefly outlined, it was a problem throughout the investigation, throughout the trial. So once we got the conviction, it was a huge relief. Of course, after the second conviction, we were just exhilarated about the whole thing.
Though it may only take a small amount of poison to kill, these toxic chemicals leave a telltale trail only forensic science can trace. And with it, the silent killers come to light, and their heinous crimes become all too clear.